All right, guys. Hello, everyone. So good to see everyone here today on this beautiful sunny day. Welcome all to TRC's 21st annual fundraiser event, where we'll be discussing the next great migration. My name is Isaiah Moore, and I'm the former volunteer manager and currently a proud volunteer for TRC, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we dive in, let's start with some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube in the coming days. We will email the link to everyone in attendance today. You can submit questions at any time through the chat. You will also have the opportunity to unmute and ask questions of the panelists during the open Q&A portion of the discussion. Also, there was a survey sent out and we're still collecting information from that survey. People are still filling it out. So if you haven't yet, you still have some time, and we're gonna go over the results of those of that survey later. So if you still have some time and you haven't done it yet, please feel free to do so. Awesome. So in a moment, we'll hear from TRC's Executive Director, Patricia Abrams, followed by a short presentation on the facts surrounding today's topic. Then we'll launch into the discussion with our expert panelists with some questions we prepared, and we'll encourage our guests to ask additional questions in the audience Q&A. Finally, as this is our annual fundraiser event, we will share with you some ways to get engaged with TRC and allow the opportunity for you to join a breakout room with TRC board members and staff to discuss.
Good morning. My name is Pat Abrams. I'm the Executive Director of the Renaissance Collaborative. I apologize for being muted and you couldn't hear me as I was speaking initially. I'm going to give you a short welcome and tell you a little bit about the agency, the Renaissance Collaborative. So first, let me welcome each and every one of you for tuning in for this session and discussion. We're all looking forward to um, what each of our panelists has to say about this particular subject matter. It has been a discussion at the Chicago Rehab Network for several years. And before I start, I just want to put a remembrance out for Janet Smith, who helped the whole affordable housing industry in so many ways and was actually responsible for one of our panelists, Stacy Sutton. So Professor Sutton is joining us as a panelist today as a result of Janet's work. Janet's passed about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I guess maybe it hasn't been that long. It seemed like it was just yesterday. But the affordable housing industry lost a giant. Um, so let me tell you a little bit about us. The Renaissance Collaborative was incorporated as an award-winning affordable housing with supportive services environment. And we were started in 1992 by 4 historical churches in the Bronzeville area. Those churches were Quinn Chapel AME, Apostolic Faith, St. Thomas Episcopal, and St. Elizabeth Roman Catholic. All were historic in their own rights in that they were first African American parishes of those particular denominations. Our mission was really pretty comprehensive, and it takes us back to the original mission of this building, which was the former Wabash YMCA, that really focused on helping people achieve self-sufficiency, um, family unity, community pride, and cooperation. So we really started to get together with those 4 churches to see how we could reinstill those same values as Bronzeville was beginning to grow. I think we do work in 4 distinct areas, which we've always done: health and wellness, employment and education, as well as job retention and training. We also work in education and employment and life skills services. Going to unmute. I'm not really sure why this computer keeps going back to unmute, mute. At any rate, can you guys hear me at all? Yeah, okay. So I don't know why it keeps getting back to this is a technical difficulties. Every time I look up there again, it's back on the mute sign, and I haven't touched it, so I don't really know what's going on with this. But as I said, we were started by the four historical churches. We actually believe in the same concept that existed in Bronzeville years ago before it became known as Bronzeville, which is self-determination, self-sufficiency, family unity, and community cooperation. So those are values that are very much instilled in the organization's history. We provide supportive care for former homeless adults and for very low income senior citizens. So our journey in our work started in 1992 when we first coalesced those four churches and continues today as we continue to reach out to make sure that the least of those individuals in this community have an opportunity to live and to stay in Bronzeville as a part of Bronzeville as the area continues to gentrify. Um, all of our services currently are on site, including property management, where we have a maintenance and janitor on site, as well as the leasing and the property manager on site. We also have all the four service people. Now it's five because we have a trainer that's also on site. So residents are able to get the support they need to take the next step forward on their journey to becoming self-sufficient. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to um, Tara, maybe? No, Isaiah. Is it Tara or Isaiah who's leading this?
Isaiah. Yep.
Okay, Isaiah, I'm turning it back over to Isaiah to continue the dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pat. Before we have our discussion with our panelists, we want to ensure we all have the same basic information surrounding the facts and context of this topic. Most of the information I'll be sharing is from a 2019 report from the Institute of Research on Race and Policy at UIC. We recommend you read it if you find today's discussion interesting. So, the Great Migration. What is commonly referred to as the Great Migration is actually comprised of two periods before and after World War II, where millions of African Americans left the South looking for a better life in the northern cities. In Chicago, the Black population grew from around 40,000 in 1910 to over 1 million in 1980. Escaping racial violence and pursuing economic and educational opportunities were some of the driving forces for individuals and families making this move. The first destination for many of the new arrivals was TRC's very own Wabash YMCA. Due to segregation, there were no hotels or otherwise that served people of color. The Wabash Y served as an orientation center with a temporary lodging and job training. The Y also served as a community hub, a gathering place for intellectuals and social activists, which is why Carter G. Woodson announced the first Negro Black History Week here in 1926, the predecessor of today's Black History Month. TRC was formed to save the Wabash Y from demolition and holds this annual fundraiser every February to celebrate the building's legacy as the birthplace of Black History Month. Be sure to join us for the historic tour this Saturday, February 26th. The decrease in Chicago's Black population is actually not a new phenomenon, although in recent years it has been getting a lot of press. Since 1980, the Black population has decreased by a third. The white population has also seen a comparable decline. But there are some notable differences in the data about where these groups are moving to. So, where are African Americans moving to? White movers who leave the Midwest are moving to the coast, while Black movers who leave the area are more than likely to go to southern states like Georgia, Texas, and Mississippi. These two charts showcase the top destinations for Black movers leaving the city of Chicago. Although there are many claims that most of Chicago's Black population is moving back to the South, in actuality, over half of all Black and white residents leaving Cook County relocated within the state of Illinois or to the bordering states of Indiana and Wisconsin. This seems to imply that people still have ties to the city and don't want to move too far from it. This all begs the question of why. What factors are causing this mass exodus of Black Chicagoans? One answer the UIC report gives is growing racial inequality in the city. When looking at unemployment rates of the Black and white Chicago residents, there are stark differences. Even during periods of economic growth, Black unemployment remained 2 to 3 times higher than white unemployment. Deindustrialization in the 1980s mainly affected Black workers. White unemployment stabilized around 5%, while Black unemployment grew to be 4 times higher than white unemployment. Additionally, wage gaps showcase another pattern of inequality that has been growing in the city of Chicago. When the wage gap was better in Chicago than in the southern cities, Chicago's Black population grew and vice versa. Wage discrimination was at its lowest when the population peaked in 1980. At this point, Black Chicagoans were paid 5% less than white Chicagoans. However, wage gaps only increased from there. In 2010, Black workers' wages were 22% less than whites, a level that is comparable to that observed in 1950, 14 years prior to the Civil Rights Act. When comparing the average characteristics of the destination of white movers versus Black movers, we find that white movers are most likely to relocate to states experiencing an economic boom meanwhile. Black movers relocate to more affordable areas with less economic activity, such as Gary, Indiana, Southern Illinois, or Mississippi. Racial equity shows that both Black and white movers are going to places that are more equitable than Cook County, but Black movers are going to slightly more equitable destinations than white movers. Increasing racial inequity in Chicago has become evident in many other ways, such as a 450% increase of incarceration of predominantly Black residents, CPS school closings that disproportionately affected Black students, the destruction of majority Black affordable housing projects in the 1990s, and disproportionate effects of city fines and tickets are just a few important factors contributing to this situation. Chicago's Black population is still one of the largest in the country, second only to New York. It's important to discuss this phenomenon considering that this city has been a major center for Black political power, culture, and community. Now that we've been able to look at the overview of the subject, it's time to introduce our panelists. Going in order of the promo image, can each of you please unmute and give us your name, title, and how your work relates to this subject?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Stacy Sutton, and I am an associate professor of urban planning and policy at UIC, University of Illinois Chicago. And I would say my work is directly connected to this. I work on issues of racial equity, inequity, neighborhood change, gentrification, and what I call kind of punitive city policies.
Good afternoon. My name is Lionel Kimball. I'm an associate professor of history at Chicago State University. I'm so happy to be here today working with Isaiah and Tara and Pat. Again, I've done so much work here. I think my work deals with largely looking at Black political thought, Black political activism in Chicago during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So much of my work deals with some of the second Great Migration period. But I think at the more personal level, I'm a lifelong Chicago resident. My grandparents grew up in Bronzeville in the 1920s or so, and so um, I'm the former vice president of Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of African American Life and History. As Isaiah mentioned before, that's the place where the Y was the place where Carter G. Woodson announced the beginning of Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. So I'm very much connected to the Wabash Y through my personal life, my recreational life. I used to work out at the Wabash Y in the gymnasium downstairs, and I've just done so much stuff there, and it's just really a pleasure to be here and to have these conversations with Dr. Sutton and everyone. There's really everyone on the line here, Ron, and everyone here. So.
And thanks again, too, as well, for inviting me out. I'm Sharon Corbett. I'm actually the president of a firm that I launched. It's called EPI LLC, and it focuses on facility management opportunities and actually engaging minority businesses to be able to partner with my organization with large corporations. I also serve as an adjunct professor at DePaul University, and my key focus is poverty, inequality, and public policy, urban poverty, and also metropolitan courses in which I lecture on. So my tie, as it relates to my career, and then also this presentation on today, is primarily from my focus of having over 15 plus years in affordable housing. And I once served as the Deputy Chief of Operations for the Chicago Housing Authority. So this topic is near and dear, but it's a topic that needs to be discussed, especially in our community. So thanks for having me on today. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for those lovely introductions of yourselves. We're going to start the Q&A session of our discussion today with our panelists. And this first question is directed to you, Dr. Sutton. Since the pandemic, have there been any significant changes or additions to the findings of the 2019 report?
Thanks, Isaiah. Well, there've been a lot. We didn't update the report per se, but I think we all have heard in the news and we've experienced it in our communities. The rate at which people continue to leave the city. Yeah. So I think the report ended. The last data point is probably 2017, although it came out in 19 in terms of the census that we were using, or American Community Survey. But since then, now that the 2020 census is out, we've seen that the population continued to decline. Black population continued to decline, not at the rate it declined between 2000 and 2010. But it is still declining, which is disconcerting. But it's also significant because over the last few decades, Chicago overall, the population overall has been declining. Yeah. But now what we're seeing is the white population is actually growing, but the Black population continues to decline at a slower rate, but still. But what that means is we're going to see even a wider gap in terms of population. So that is one thing that we need to keep in mind, because we hear on the radio that, oh, Chicago's doing well, Chicago's growing, people are coming back to Chicago. But then when you look at that by race, you realize that that's not exactly fully accurate. I mean, it is. Chicago's doing well for some, but for a lot of others, for folks in Bronzeville, for folks on the south side and west side, a lot of folks are struggling. And, the pandemic further kind of complicated the issues by far. I mean, the trends were what they were before the pandemic hit, but the pandemic has only exacerbated it.
Thank you so much for that. This one is directed towards Dr. Kimball. What similarities and differences do you see between this modern Great Migration versus the Great Migration of the 20th century?
That's a really good question. I mean, and I think the best way to think about it are to think about some of the factors that brought people to Chicago during the Great Migration periods. And I think quite generically, we see access to jobs, access to better education, or any education at that point. Because when we consider the educational opportunities in places in the Deep South, they were almost non-existent for an entire year adequate education. We see access to the franchise, the ability to participate in political, the everyday political life of American citizens. We see the existence of groups like the Pullman Porters and the Chicago Defender, which were bringing people here, right? So if we think about historically why people came, right, there are largely these opportunities that existed in northern cities like Chicago that didn't exist in the South, right? But I think now, if we try to figure out, well, what's driving people away, I think a lot of the information came from the slides, is the inability to find adequate jobs, have access to adequate education. I mean, I think we all know about the controversies about the closing of the schools under Rahm Emanuel's administration. Right? We know about increased police brutality, these increased racial tensions that exist in places like Chicago. Right? And we think about Jim Grossman, who's quite famously has written a number of works looking at the Great Migration, and others have called Chicago the Promised Land. And I think if we really consider what Chicago was, I think a more accurate description was as Chicago as a flawed promised land. There were these opportunities that were here, but it was by no means a perfect location. And I think looking back at contemporary Chicago, I think that some of those problems have been exacerbated, right? There is some hope, because if we really take a look at the political repression in places in the South, right, the systematic removal of voting rights of Black and brown people, there are these opportunities, right, that exist now that Black people will have more access to political power and have a political voice. But I think by and large there are some similarities, but I think the flawedness of Black Chicago and flawedness of the Great Migration is still existing. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Professor Corbett, how does gentrification play a role in the decline of the Black population? Oh, I think you're muted still.
Yeah, I said, hey, let me make sure I unmute myself. So great question, right? And so, when you think about gentrification, its role in the decline of the Black population, there's just several factors just to think about. One, it's really primarily based upon the withdrawal of resources from Black communities. Is really contributing to the decline of the Black population in Chicago, and not necessarily gentrification, right? Because when you think about those resources that have been taken away, and Dr. Kimball had basically mentioned this too as well, Bronzeville is a great example. Under Rahm Emanuel's administration, right, we had a total of 18 public schools that closed down during that time frame, right? There's also been additional resources taken away in regards to access to high-paying job opportunities. So many times you'll hear executives, especially from certain financial institutions I'm not going to name, that would pretty much identify and say, what, we can't find highly qualified, educated Blacks to fulfill these high-paying jobs. And you also get that a lot with tech firms too as well. So when you think about that net premise in regards to high-paying jobs, Blacks are seeking not entry-level positions, right? We're looking for high-paying jobs, high-paying salaries, because we do have the educational attainment. We have the most as it relates to financial debt for higher education too. But we're looking for overall that long-term economic stability, right? And you're finding that in other geographical locations, when you had mentioned individuals are migrating to Georgia, Texas, Arizona, for example, we're looking for those opportunities, similar opportunities here. So it's not necessarily gentrification playing a role, but it's those lack of resources that have been taken away from our communities.
Excellent response. This is for anybody. What do you believe will be the most significant impacts this immigration has on Chicago life and culture?
That's a good question.
That is.
If I can jump in with a story, years ago, I've had the fortune of living in Bronzeville, and I've been living in the neighborhood for about 20 years. I think I've told Isaiah this story. My people were in Chicago in 1905, so before the boundaries of, I think, the Great Migration. So every time I talk about going down home, and I'm talking about going to Mississippi, I'm talking about going to 39th and Dearborn, right? So that's really But I had this conversation. I had a number of very great mentors when I came back to Chicago from Iowa. And two of the people were Chris Reed and Tim Black. And years ago, we had a conversation about the future of Bronzeville. And, one of the things we were just throwing out, what happens to Bronzeville under gentrification, right? And we see this, so we all know that historically the name comes from what people looked like when they lived here, right? And what happens to Bronzeville when the neighborhood changes demographically, right? So I think that's something, and as a historian, there's the we're connected to that name, and naming is very important to Black folk, right? Why we choose to name ourselves and how we name our communities are important. And I think by and large, one of the significant challenges we may face is how do we define our neighborhood when the demographics have changed? People came to Bronzeville because it culturally this was our space, right? And what happens when this is no longer strictly our space, and how do we define what it means to be Black in this neighborhood and throughout Black Chicago?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that was a wonderful response. I'm not a long-term Chicagoan. Yeah, I've only been here about 6 years. I come from New York, and so in many ways, I'm seeing a lot of the trends here that experienced in Brooklyn, both growing up, but then more recently in terms of gentrification, as well as some of these other trends. And so that's kind of what I want to speak to. I absolutely agree with Professor Corbett, but I also would say I think there is gentrification occurring, and the challenge we have before us is dealing with even the stratification within our community, right? Because we experience these processes very differently, right? There's still, and always has been, this very strong and vibrant Black middle class in Chicago. However, there's also a very large kind of working class and poor population of Black residents on the south side of Chicago. And their experience of, or I would just say our experience of gentrification is very different, right? So, but what I fully agree with is the notion that gentrification doesn't just happen, right? You can only have gentrification if there was systematic disinvestment. And so we have years and years, decades of systematic disinvestment in our neighborhoods, public and private sector disinvestment. We as a people have always invested in our communities. We feel very passionately and love the community. Although I'm not from here, I am in Bronzeville now and I love this community. But because of the systematic disinvestment, we can now have an influx of capital. But then you couple that with the fact, all of the things my colleagues have mentioned, if there's a lack of opportunity, a lack of thriving jobs, thriving wage jobs, not just getting by, but thriving wage jobs, right? Not all of us are trained for tech and finance. And there's discrimination in those industries, even among those who are. But folks need thriving wage jobs to be able to stay in the city, right? To pay all the tickets that people get to inflation, to deal with the prices in the supermarket, right? I mean, people need thriving wage jobs. And so those opportunities are not here. People will have to find opportunities elsewhere. If you close community schools and you don't invest in our public school system, people will leave. That again, I mean, it's a vicious cycle, right? Structural racism is a vicious cycle because it then leaves empty an opportunity for capital to enter,
right,
and then inflate property values, and it goes on and on and on, and folks just can't stay, essentially.
Awesome responses. So this next question is like a two-part question. Do we still have faith in Black political leadership here in Chicago? And what significant strides has Black political representation made to keep the Black population strong in Chicago?
I want to see who's in attendance before I answer.
Me too. I'm like, I'm gonna be quiet. Let's see who jumps.
So
Well, I think politically speaking, we can't deny that Chicago has far and away led the way in Black political participation and thought. There's a reason why people like John Jones, who came here as a former slave with $3.50 in his pocket and rose to be one of the most prominent and wealthiest African Americans in the United States, and became the first person elected to the Cook County Commission as a Cook County Commissioner. There's a reason why Oscar the Priest and Arthur Works Mitchell and Carol Moseley Braun and Barack Obama and you know, all of these people whose name I'm ignoring at this particular point and not mentioning at this particular point. There's a reason why they chose to come to Chicago, because as these great race men and women came here, as you know, with these ambitions to do something better, you know, Chicago provided access to not only them but to all of us who sought some sort of audience with local government. You know, Big Bill Thompson, you know, created these opportunities for Black people to get involved politically. You know, one of the people I write about, Ed Kelly, offered opportunities for African Americans to get involved, appointing corporation councils and like. And I think over time, our involvement in electoral politics was an important one. But I think what happens, and a friend of mine who used to work at Chicago State, he's out of Seton Hall now. He says he mentioned this in one talk we did together. The problem we have now is that the dynamics have changed because our politicians and our political activists have quite often moved from protest into politics, and there's a certain burden that comes with being an elected official and working through the established political structure. I think that there's a great amount of hope. I mean, I'm kind of encouraged that we have so many supermajority Black wards, but I'm also fearful as we look at the debates around, you know, redistricting maps and what does that mean for the dispersal of Black political power. I mean, you know, who's going to lose a ward when they have the first supermajority Asian American ward over in Chinatown? Someone has to lose that ward. You know, white folks are going to lose it, the Latinos are going to lose one, or we're going to lose one. So there's some give and take, and I think by and large we're getting much more things taken from us than we're gaining at this point.
Yeah, and so I was going to actually add to that too as well, right? What Dr. Kimball mentioned, and so when I think of like the political arena today in particular, as it relates to Black representation, I instantly think of our current mayor, Lori Lightfoot, right? First African American or Black female mayor for the city of Chicago, openly LGBTQIA within the community, right? But one of the key things that I must say that Mayor Lightfoot has done a phenomenal job on is that first, you know, having a vision to say, what is it that we need to do to reinvest in far south side, far west side cities of Chicago that mostly are plagued by decades and decades of disinvestment. And so I think I always give kudos to this mayor for leading the charge and actually, you know, tapping Maurice Cox and appointing him back in October of 2019 to be Chicago's commissioner of the Department of Planning and Development. And as a result of that, you know, we've seen great solicitations go out on the street for invest in South and West Side. We've seen more activity around involvement as it relates to the pumping of about $750 million from private sector funds into these initiatives to basically help to calibrate more economic stability long term. And so when I think of that representation, I automatically gravitate towards what's going on actively today with Mayor Lightfoot.
Thank you so much for that. My next question is for anyone again. How does this impact the average person living in Chicago who decides to and is able to stay?
And when you say this, you are referring to what, the migration, or are you talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, in so many ways, it's a question of what happens to those who remain in place, right? And as opposed to those who leave. And it really depends on who those persons are, right? I mean, in the sense of, in some neighborhoods, what we have is just a dearth of population. It's just not is not populated. It's not dense enough to attract some types of investments. So then you have a mix of vacancy and long-term residents who have been there for some time, but then all the amenities are leaving, right? And so I think what Professor Corbin just mentioned in terms of the type of investment that's needed in communities, so that those who are there and have been there can stay in place and can afford to stay in place. We can spend the whole time talking about the various policies and planning initiatives that would allow for that. But I think the intention, the notion that we have to think about those who remain in place, right? And the kinds of investment necessary. And I would actually push just a little bit further in saying that Invest Southwest is an extremely important and brave initiative that Commissioner Cox is leading, that the mayor kind of initiated. But under that, a small component of that is another thing that they're investing in, which is community wealth building, right? And that is not, I think folks hear that and they think, oh, that's just about individual wealth. No, actually, it's a very different way of thinking about community wealth. And I believe, and that's a lot of the research I do, is I don't think that the wealth that any individual creates, it doesn't have the spillover effects necessary to support those who are here. We have to think more collectively. We've done the individual entrepreneurship strategy, and it's worked for some, but it hasn't worked for others. And so this new investment that will soon be fully public in community wealth building, I think that is the direction that a lot of cities are going. And well, thus far, it's only been a few cities, but we're leading the way with New York and Denver that have really adopted that as a strategy, and it's been adopted through the Office of Economic and Racial Justice, right? So the intentionality around collective ownership, owning both land and businesses collectively, collective decision making, really allowing folks to have agency in their neighborhood.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Sutton. I have two more questions. This first one is directed towards Professor Corbett, but anyone can answer if you all have thoughts. What opportunities currently are there within the Chicago area specifically geared towards Black people that are encouraging them to stay in Chicago?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And so when I think about it, I think off top, and from my experience, that Black people aren't necessarily attracted to programming. We need programs. But our attraction comes from, we want a great quality of life too, right? And so when you think about this great quality of life for yourself, your family members and friends and so forth too as well, and what's included in that to even achieve that long-term economic stability. And I talk about this a lot. And so I instantly think of several encouraging opportunities, right? And so we talk about, individuals that may have silos in regards to their own businesses that they have established and so forth too, as well in larger corporations. But from my experience, one of the key things I always tell people to do, right, or what you could do, is join the Chicago Minority Supplier Development Council, CMSDC. Get in partnership with them. And the reason why I say that is because right now, today, they have over 250 private public buying organizations with 1,000. They only have 1,000 minority businesses. And so what's happening today is that a lot of these organizations, such as, Microsoft, BMO Harris, Deloitte, even Illinois Toll Road, has basically identified in a collective up to $3 billion in annual purchases that they would like to make from minority firms. And so that's one thing from an economic opportunity. Consider joining this organization to be able to tap into the $3 billion, because you may be employing other Blacks and you can expand those opportunities. I also instantly think of the state of Illinois. They've really ramped up this state of Illinois Department of Central Management Services, which is called BEP for short, Business Enterprise Program. And they're actually located like 100 West Randolph. And the great thing about this organization is that once you join and become a part of it too as well, they have set-asides that are already carved out for minority firms, right? And so and on a monthly basis, just to say, hey, we know it's a pandemic, so much has occurred, but these are opportunities. I think that Chicago has also really pushed in streamlining their Chicago Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Department, which is BACP. And the great thing about it is, like, if you were launching a business, you have a business existing, if you're fresh out of college, fresh out of school, maybe you can't necessarily land that job instantly. Well, they have free legal assistance services around the clock to help you with your business as a strategy. Do you mind if I list a few, just mention a few more, if that's okay? Okay. Because I know for the sake of time. And so again, I just love what Chicago has done with BACP in regards to revamping that program. And so they use this entity called SCORE, not-for-profit, with legal advisors. And so I told you early on, like, I have a background in housing, right? And so being at the Chicago Housing Authority and just understanding housing in general, I love to remind people that, you know, as a Black person, we are not monolithic. Therefore, we again have varying views, right? You know, based upon sometimes our socioeconomic class, our education, our perspective, our background, and so forth. And so when you start to discuss the cost of living, one thing that I can say is that many people may or may not agree on is that for the city of Chicago, you know, it's an increasing number of housing insecurity that's going on. So individuals that are renting or have a mortgage are now being burdened because they have to allocate 30% or more of their income towards shelter and housing. And so when you think of cost of living, I love to still talk about the Chicago Housing Authority and promote it. And again, I'm not saying all Black folks need Chicago Housing Authority, right? That's not the case. We want high paying jobs, right? So we don't have to meet those threshold minimums. We want to do well. But when you think of the Chicago Housing Authority, just to promote, it's the second largest public housing authority in the United States, behind New York City's Housing Authority. They serve over 68,000 people. Majority of the staff is Black, highly educated, and pushing forward on public policies and everyday processes to help individuals towards upward mobility. So when you think of Chicago Housing Authority, just know that they are a special program. They're the only ones to have an MTW set aside that's moving to work organization, which allows them to get so much more funding to help so many people in the city of Chicago. They have specialized programs for upward mobility. So if you were a voucher holder, even if it was a form of Section 8 voucher, project-based voucher, they have programming to help push you towards home ownership, and you can utilize that voucher too. Another great thing that I love to talk about the Chicago Housing Authority is that they had launched so many new programs. You know, even those that were part of their programs, from having vouchers and so forth too as well. They have a jock program, and so what they're doing is really pushing towards Section 3 compliance for businesses to give any and everybody who failed in the low income, the very low income category, an opportunity to create their business, pick up a trade. They've done partnerships with Lowe's, SBA, and also financial institutions too as well. And the last thing I'll say is that when we think about these opportunities from an educational standpoint, right, we have great professors that are a part of this virtual platform right now. And I highly encourage you to seek out their university opportunities. But I always tell my youth, or those that are going into college or soon to graduate, or even if you're just trying to get reskilled, retooled, you know, to just re-prepare yourself for life, I talk about cybersecurity. And the reason why I talk about cybersecurity is that I didn't have a background in it, right? But there are grants readily available through many of the higher education institutions. And what we found through recent forums that I was a part of is that currently, as of 2030, there's approximately $75 billion set aside in demand for minorities to tap into any type of job for cybersecurity. So even if you get a free certification, ethical hacking for beginnings, introduction to cloud security, there are opportunities. And I think that we've got to get our community ready for what's to come in the tech universe. We need to be at the forefront for those opportunities if we want long-term economic stability. It can't just only be the West Loop that's identified to have Googles and Facebook and so forth too as well. Our communities of Bronzeville, Inglewood, Auburn, Gresham, and other communities need to have access to this, or at least have some of these satellite locations at those facilities. And again, you know, I also tell from an educational standpoint, like now is the time that we're seeing an increase, that we need way more planners, right? You know, if you say you want to make a change within your community, we also need policy majors. We need more attorneys, especially for so much that we've seen with George Floyd and so many others, and then healthcare officials too. So these are just there are educational opportunities that are out here, and I'll be able to provide Tara maybe a link later on to some key things. And there are also other organizations that I'm really big on. This is the last thing, and I promise I'm going to be quiet, right? CSW is the Chicago Foundation for Women. That is spearheaded by Felicia Davis. She is a Black female from the South Side of Chicago. She went to Percy L. Julian, and she's done a phenomenal job as it relates to investing in women, organizations that support women, girls, transgender, non-binary individuals. And their goal is to fight many of the problems that are facing women. So you're going to find them a lot in DC, pushing for economic stability, ending violence towards these groups, and also health and information and wellness. You know, American Civil Liberties Union, you know, if you're an advocate in regards to racial justice, the liberty to freedom of expression, I always advocate for this organization. You can donate, you can volunteer to these organizations, and I have so many more. I have 20 Black organizations you can also become a part of. And but I can send it to you, Tara. Do you want me to name them? You just tell me. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. That was so helpful, Professor Corbett. But now it's time to get to the main idea, the reason why we are all here today, and that is, how can the average person help to combat this outward migration?
It's me again, of course. I know I said get involved, right?
Mhm.
And I mentioned key organizations, right? And so again, I'll send a list over with other organizations, but at least these organizations off top can help you as a Black person in regards to racial injustice. I think that that's one of the biggest issues that continues to play, not just Chicago, but many cities too as well. We talk a lot about police reform as a part of that too as well. And so I'll get a link over again. One of the key organizations is American Civil Liberties Union. Uh, get involved with the organization today, right?
Isaiah, if I can do it, just a shameless plug. I think Professor
Yeah.
Corbett talked about cybersecurity and policy, and I think, you know, just as a shameless plug for both Chicago State and UIC, I think UIC is an excellent place for people who do policy work. And I'm sure that Dr. Sutton will agree. And just as a shameless plug for my employer, you know, Chicago State has a new and very robust cybersecurity program. This, I think, is about 5-6 years old. So if anyone's looking for more opportunities, I would, you know, reach out to me, or if I may volunteer, Dr. Sutton, you know, for more information about, you know, doing policy work around race and doing cybersecurity and getting access to some of these training programs and these institutions that can allow, you know, Black Chicagoans to do for ourselves.
Absolutely, and I would just put an exclamation point on that, because, you know, UIC, there's so many opportunities in terms of those who are going to college or looking to go to college. You know, in my college within the university, the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, which Isaiah is a graduate of. We have an undergraduate program in urban studies, but we have a graduate programs in urban planning and policy. And the reason that's important, whatever you choose to do, the reason what's really important right now is critical thinking skills and a set of analytical skills and a sense of social justice, right? When you bring those together, you can major in anything, you can focus in anything, but if you have these critical thinking skills and you can combine it with kind of an analytical kind of set of tools, and your vision and your passion and your your understanding really about justice, about racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, right? Just put all of those under social justice. If that is your ethic, then there's so many places to plug in. Chicago, perhaps more than any city I've been to, has such a robust kind of a landscape of organizers, spaces for organizing, formal organizations, organizations that are around electoral politics. I mean, there's just that to me is, there's no shortage of that. It's really about you just trying to figure out where you want to plug in.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you.
Isaiah, I just wanted to lift up the Shared Equity Cooperative as an ownership strategy for very low income individuals, and that the city of Chicago has adopted both that and the land trust as a way of people beginning to develop some equity in where they live.
Yeah, and I would only add, Ms. Abrams, that you don't, I think we stigmatize, as we stigmatize public housing, we stigmatize this kind of shared equity, these cooperative housing. And where I come from, cooperative means the most posh
Exactly.
high-rise buildings in New York are co-ops, right?
Right.
And so they're market rate or beyond market rate. But you can also just have a fine, dignified kind of apartment or housing, a townhouse that's connected to others. The benefit of, when I talk about cooperative community wealth building, is individually you might not be able to do things. You might not be able to start your business individually. You might not have enough for a certain type of housing, but collectively we can. And we've been focused on the individual because that is the ethic of the American way. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying, if that is if that's your jam, you're going to keep doing that. But we also have to understand that the community wealth building, cooperatives, shared housing, community land trusts, these are tools that have been working for decades. And there's a renaissance essentially of these tools since the financial crisis. And more cities and more communities are saying, hey, well, there are things we can do to keep our land affordable and keep it in the community. We can establish a community land trust. The things we can do, a bunch of us can start a business, and there's a way of doing that so that we all are owners and workers in that business. There's so much I can say, but if you're interested in these ideas, please feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, before we even go any further, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Sutton, Dr. Kimball, and Professor Corbett. Y'all have been absolutely amazing, and honestly, all of the words you have spoken are golden. So we're so thankful to have you here with us today to talk about this very important thing. So now we're going to move on and talk about audience engagement. Before this event, we asked everyone who RSVP'd to answer a quick survey, and we want to share some of the overall results with you. So this slide just shows that there's a wide range of ethnicities represented here, and that's pretty cool that we were able to get a lot of people from different backgrounds to share. So you guys can look at that and see, who's representing. And then so this is about the residency, and currently who's considering to relocate, and then who is currently a Chicago resident, which, yeah, cool. And then these are some of the factors that we feel are making people leave Chicago. For which one? For current residents that are considering leaving, cost of living is the most common reason, for sure. And then 2/3 of non-Chicago resident attendees used to live in Chicago. Of those that used to live here, 3/4 stayed within the Chicago metro area. And just like those who are considering moving, the individuals who left cited cost of living as the most common reason for leaving. And I would definitely echo this, because as a graduate student who has graduated and gone through I can tell you that finding a job that is able to maintain the lifestyle that I want in Chicago is very difficult. Um, and then I now want to open the floor up to our attendees to share their personal experiences and ask questions of the panelists if they have any. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak, and we'll give you the ability to unmute. Ira, if you can unmute.
I'm looking in the
Testing.
chat. I think Phyllis was having difficulty finding how to unmute the unmute button.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I put in a question at 12:58. If you focus in the chat room, you can see that.
Oh, yes. Okay, I see it. So Ira's question is it time for a second Great Migration? If so, what is the profile of the people we would like to attract?
Well, I think that there were a certain set of conditions, in my opinion, that helped contribute to the Great Migration. And I think Professor Corbett talked about it a little bit earlier when she talked about jobs. And one of the things that made Chicago so attractive was that there were these jobs that people were able to get involved in. And I think she spoke a great deal about high paying jobs, but I think that there was a usefulness of having an opportunity to work in the stockyards or in the steel mills or in service. I work in the post office. You know, I'm a post office kid, and I think that the part of the difficulty of motivating people to move to a place like Chicago without those opportunities would make a second migration somewhat difficult. I don't want to discount, right? Because I'm thinking about some of these issues, and I think most of us are rather concerned with the prospects in the future of voting rights in this country. I think those people who would tend to leave and participate in a great migration type of movement, that may be one of the motivating factors that would push them out of the South. There are studies being done now how conservatives are moving from liberal states to conservative areas. The polarization of electoral politics in this country is becoming much more entrenched than I think we've ever seen probably since the Civil War. And there has to be a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think the lack of adequate high paying jobs that allow for folks who are seeking to enter into the middle class that existed in the 19 teens through the 1970s. Without something like that, I think it may be difficult to motivate a migration like we've seen in the past with the past two. And of course, it's very expensive to live in Chicago. I think some of the surveys, and we've all talked about this, is extremely expensive. And I think people are maybe hesitant to move to a place in which, the perception of widespread violence is there as well. So I mean, I don't know. I'm not overly optimistic in the conditions we have now. But I think it's possible, but I don't think we're seeing on the scope that we've seen before.
So Sheila asks, discuss some of the ways that the contemporary outmigration of Black people affects poor Black women and their family.
So, yeah. Well, I guess I'm trying to see, because it's how it affects poor Black people and families. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the networks, right? And so we've always depended on each other, as they say, to raise our children, to get by, to have support, both familial kind of blood, family, but also chosen family and friends. And so, who's going to watch the kids when you're working late? If the only thing you can do is like pay for a babysitter. That has not been, for many of us, that hasn't been what we've had to do, because we've had family around and we've had friends that we trust. The community can hold us, essentially. So when people leave en masse, it leaves these huge gaps in the rearing process, but also gaps in employment, because more than any other kind of employer, Black businesses hire Black folks more than any other business, just proportionally. So if a young mother needs a job to keep food on the table, but has some challenges in terms of their access, and there are not many Black-owned businesses, it'll be further challenged, because who's going to employ her, and how far does she have to travel to get to this job? So I think about it in terms of community and keeping community whole. And what does that mean? We need people, we need amenities, we need services, we need infrastructure, right? When any of those things break down, we don't have transportation in many of our communities. When any of those components break down, it adversely affects our community, and hence people start to leave. And those who remain are worse off, because they have to really figure out how to make ends meet. And that's not just in terms of putting food on the table, but how to do all the things you need to do to raise your family.
And I'm going to piggyback that.
Yeah.
Dr. Sutton is spot on, right? And one of the things I was going to add to it is that, when middle income to upper income Blacks leave, and we consider those that are low income to very low income that remain, who's going to advocate for them that look like them?
Right.
And so, yes, we talked about access to transportation, access to, child care. We talked about also earlier, like food insecurity, right? And, healthcare insecurity. And so there are so many insecurities that are out there, housing insecurity, so forth. And so when and if you're thinking about leaving the city of Chicago, right, and you fall in these categories, you're educated, not educated, even if you're just pushing for change from an actionable standpoint, you're the advocate, right? And this is one of the key reasons why you should remain, because we need you and others need you too.
And that's really one of the, if we look at what happened to Bronzeville after 1948, after restrictive covenants were deemed unconstitutional and Black people, and I think it's very easy to blame white flight and the demise of places like Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago. But one thing that we don't talk enough about is what happens when, I think, let's call them the Black leadership class, leaves Bronzeville and moves to other neighborhoods. There's no people there to advocate for them anymore. I think you're spot on that one.
Yeah. Last question from the audience is from Phyllis. She said, what are the future plans to change our directional course to save Black communities? You're muted, Dr. Sutton.
Of course, I had a whole I would say, and I've said it already, but I'll say it again, I think the path forward for us as a community is community wealth building, right? Because it's about a systems change. It's about a different approach to community economic development that's not focused on just any individual, but rather what does it mean to build the wealth of our communities collectively. It's about shared prosperity, racial equity, all of these ecological sustainability, all of those components, right? Without those, if we take a myopic view and just focus on one thing, I personally don't think that will work. I think we have to take this kind of systems view, bigger view, and really learn to trust each other and support each other, because we have to do this together. I don't see the strategies used in the past as the ones that are going to propel us in the future.
Awesome. Any other final questions? Awesome. Well, I think, once again, thank you so much to the panelists. Y'all have been awesome and very informative questions to our answers to our audience's questions. We thank you so much. So thank you all for joining us for this discussion. We have one more item on the agenda before you go. This is TRC's fundraiser event, so we want to let you know how you can get involved with TRC, and there are a lot of great ways. So the first way, right, is our greatest need right now is for a non-board members to serve on our committees. Committed participants may be considered for board service in future years. The Community Relations and Resource Development Committee is responsible for fundraising and marketing for TRC, including two events. Including this one. The Program and Quality Assurance Committee reviews programs to make sure they address the needs of the community and that they are effective. The Workforce Development Committee is responsible for overseeing workforce training programs and helping them to expand for our future new workforce center. And then the Finance and Audit slash Asset and Real Estate Development Committee ensures that financial stability of the agency and finds resources to complete future community development projects. These are some of the skills that we're especially looking for potential committee members to have: legal, architect, HR, PR/marketing, fundraising, finance, project management, health and wellness, community economic development, workforce/employee development, real estate, and general business. These skills are not required, but having any of them will help us to achieve our mission and goals. Current students can apply to intern with TRC. We are currently offering internships in fundraising, communications, and community health, but we are not limited to those areas. If you are studying something different, talk to us and see if we can figure out a relevant project for you. If the previous options don't work for you, we would love to talk about your interests, skills, and availability and find a way for you to volunteer with us. I am serving in a volunteer capacity right now. We also we also just had our first of many creative art sessions at Renaissance Apartments led by a volunteer artist. You can help us plan our annual gala, or we can find other ways to use the time and talent that you can share. So if you're interested in any of these opportunities, you can join a breakout room to get your questions answered right now. Just enter in the chat what you're interested in, and we'll assign you to the proper room. Once again, y'all, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been my absolute pleasure to moderate this, seeing all of these bright, intelligent faces. So good seeing Dr. Sutton again and Dr. Kimball. Even if you don't join one of the breakout rooms, please, please, please keep in touch. We're one big community here. We all love each other. We all want to see each other thrive and not only survive, but thrive in prosperous conditions. And so we're all here for each other. So thank you so much. And I hope y'all have just a blessed day.